At my wife's funeral, my daughter told me to leave. Then the lawyer opened the will, and everything shifted. The air in the room grew heavy as every whisper fell into silence. All eyes slowly turned toward me with anticipation. What unfolded in that moment was about to reshape everything they thought they knew, leaving the entire church waiting for the words that would change the day forever. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you are watching from. It began on that cold morning, when the bells tolled and the pews filled with people whose eyes were heavy with sympathy, but whose whispers carried judgments sharper than knives. For they had seen my daughter grow into a woman they admired, while I remained the shadow at the edge of her story. The old man she introduced sparingly, if at all. And now, here I was, walking slowly behind the casket of the woman who had been the very soul of my existence, each step dragging my heart deeper into the abyss of loss. And when I finally sat in the front row, I could feel her absence pressing against me, heavier than the wooden box that lay before us. Yet even in that unbearable moment, I still expected the warmth of family, the hand of my daughter on my shoulder, the faint reminder that I was not entirely alone. But when I turned to her, I found only eyes of steel and lips pressed into a line that cut sharper than any insult. And though I tried to look away, I could not ignore the truth that had been growing between us for years. That somewhere along the line she had convinced herself that I was a burden, a relic, a man who had given all but was remembered for none of it. And it was in that sacred space of mourning that she leaned closer and hissed words that pierced me deeper than the grave awaiting my wife, telling me with the coldness of a stranger that I should leave, that I no longer belonged there, that this was her Mother's Day and not mine, and I will never forget the sound of it. The hush that followed as those nearby pretended not to hear yet could not help but glance, the pity in their eyes mingling with something uglier, something that said perhaps she was right. Perhaps the grieving widower should be sent away like a guest who overstayed his welcome. And in that moment I wanted to crumble, to vanish, to walk into the night and never return. But I stayed seated because the weight of love for my wife held me in place, because I knew she would never have wanted me to abandon her farewell, and so I endured the silence, the burning shame, the quiet humiliation of being a father unloved and a husband widowed. And as the choir sang, I let my mind drift to memories of better days, when laughter filled our kitchen and my daughter's small hand reached for mine with trust that seemed unbreakable, memories of sacrifices that built the very path she walked upon, the overtime hours, the meals skipped, the comforts denied, all so she could stand proud in the world. And yet, on this day she chose to erase it all, with a single cruel demand. But what she did not know, what not a soul in that church suspected, was that the story would not end with her command, because beyond the hymns and the prayers awaited a reckoning in the form of a sealed envelope and the steady voice of a lawyer who carried my wife's last words, words that would change everything. And though I sat in silence as the service ended and the guests shuffled out with downcast eyes, inside me a storm was gathering, for I knew that sometimes justice does not shout in the open but waits patiently in the shadows, ready to emerge when it is needed most. And that was the day my wife's love would rise from the grave to speak for me, and my daughter would learn a lesson she would never forget. The day of mourning began long before the church bells rang, because grief does not wait for ceremony, and sorrow does not care for time. I woke before the sun, staring at the ceiling of a room that suddenly felt larger, emptier, and crueler, without the sound of her breathing beside me. The sheets still held the faintest trace of her perfume, and I found myself pressing my hand against the pillow where her head once lay, as though I could will her back to me. It was not the kind of morning where you rise with purpose. It was the kind where you drag yourself from bed because you know the world demands it. I dressed slowly, my hands trembling over buttons that seemed smaller than they had ever been, the black suit hanging loose on my shoulders as if it too understood the weight of loss. When I looked into the mirror, I barely recognized the man staring back. Eyes sunken, lips thin, face carved by years of toil and love, now etched with grief too deep for words. I had buried friends, parents, even brothers, but nothing in all my years had prepared me for burying the woman who had been my partner in every storm. As I stepped outside, the winter air bit my skin, and the gray sky seemed to mourn with me, clouds heavy and unmoving as though the heavens themselves refused to shine. The streets were quiet, but inside me, the silence was louder than any noise, a hollow ringing that accompanied each slow step toward the church. By the time I reached its doors, people were already gathering, faces blurred by tears and bowed in solemn respect. Yet even in that moment, I felt the isolation of a man walking alone. Inside, the air was thick with incense and the soft rustle of coats as mourners took their seats. The wooden pews groaned under the weight of sorrow, and every stained glass window seemed to glare down with colors too bright for such a dark day. I sat in the front row, staring at the coffin draped in white lilies, their fragrance sweet yet suffocating, a cruel reminder that beauty too must wither. My chest tightened as I thought of the countless mornings we had shared, her gentle laugh when I spilled coffee, the way she touched my shoulder when words were not needed. Now, all of it was reduced to silence, to a box, to memories that felt both close enough to touch and impossibly far away. The choir began to sing, voices rising in solemn harmony, and the sound pulled at something deep within me. I thought of our first date, the nervousness in her smile, the vows we exchanged before another altar long ago, promises we had kept through hardship and joy. I remembered the nights we sat together in quiet companionship, no words needed, just the comfort of being side by side. Every note of the hymn tore at those memories, reminding me that all of it was gone, that I would walk out of that church alone. Yet even in grief, I tried to hold on to her spirit, to the certainty that she would not want me broken. I closed my eyes and whispered a silent prayer, thanking her for every moment we had shared, every sacrifice she had made, every time she had stood by me when the world seemed to turn away. My daughter sat a few rows back, her face unreadable, her hands folded neatly as if the day belonged only to her and her grief. I searched for warmth in her eyes, some trace of the girl who used to hold my hand and call me her hero, but all I found was distance. It was as though I was already a ghost, present in body but erased from her heart. Still, I clung to the memory of my wife's voice, her reassurances in quiet moments when she told me she saw me, that she knew my worth even if others refused to see it. That memory carried me through the service, through the prayers, through the final hymn. When the coffin was lifted, my knees nearly buckled, but I steadied myself and walked behind it, each step a farewell I was not ready to give. Outside, as the cold wind whipped through the cemetery, I stood with my head bowed, listening to the priest's final words as the coffin was lowered into the earth. My fingers curled into fists, not from anger but from the sheer effort of holding myself together. When the first shovel of dirt fell, I felt a piece of my heart buried with her, yet I also felt the faintest whisper in my soul, as if she were telling me to stand, to endure, to wait. It was the day of mourning, but also the beginning of something none of us could yet see. The coldness of my daughter struck me harder than the chill of the winter air that seeped through the church doors, and though I had braced myself for grief, I had not braced myself for her silence. A silence that cut deeper than any words could. When I turned to her after the service, hoping for the simplest gesture, a nod, a glance, some sign that she recognized the weight of what I was carrying, she met my eyes only briefly before shifting them away, as if I were a stranger intruding on her private sorrow. I stood there, my heart raw, expecting that perhaps it was grief clouding her expression, that perhaps in her own pain she could not find the strength to reach out. But as minutes passed, as mourners approached her with soft words and lingering embraces, she offered them a warmth she denied me. Each handshake she accepted, each tear she acknowledged, felt like a reminder that I was not welcome in her circle of grief. When I stepped closer, daring to place my hand lightly on her shoulder, she stiffened, her body turning slightly as though to shrug me off. And in that subtle movement I felt the collapse of years, the unraveling of every memory I carried of her childhood. I remembered the nights I rocked her to sleep, her small head resting against my chest, her soft breath carrying dreams I swore to protect. I remembered walking miles in the rain to fetch medicine when fever burned her tiny body, and I remembered holding her hand on her first day of school, telling her that no matter how frightening the world seemed, I would always be there. Yet now, in the very moment we should have been bound together by shared loss, she looked at me with a distance that made me feel as though none of those moments had ever existed. Her voice, when it finally came, was sharp and clipped. She asked me if I had spoken to the priest, not out of concern, but as if it were a duty I had nearly failed. There was no softness in her tone, no recognition of the fact that my heart was breaking just as hers must have been. It was as though she had built a wall between us, and she stood firmly behind it, peering at me as though I were on the wrong side. The guests, sensing the tension, grew careful in their movements, their eyes darting between us, yet no one spoke, no one dared to intervene. I wanted to ask her why. I wanted to demand what had changed, what had poisoned her heart against me, but the words lodged in my throat, trapped by fear that if I pushed too hard I would only widen the gulf. So instead, I swallowed my pain and stepped back, pretending to adjust my tie, pretending that her rejection did not pierce me like a blade. Inside, however, the wound deepened. I thought of her mother, the woman now lying beneath the earth, who had always urged patience, who had always believed that love could heal the cracks that time and misunderstanding created. I imagined her disappointment in seeing us this way, divided at the very moment unity mattered most. Still, I could not bridge the gap alone. My daughter avoided me throughout the gathering, speaking to relatives, receiving their comfort, but never once turning toward me. Her eyes lingered on me only when she thought I could not see, and in those glances I read something I wished I had not. It was not just indifference, it was disdain, the look one gives to someone who has failed. And perhaps in her mind I had failed. Perhaps she had rewritten the story of her life to paint me as weak, as unworthy, as a man who had given little when in truth I had given all. I stood quietly, watching her move through the crowd with grace that should have made me proud, but instead left me hollow. She was my daughter, my flesh and blood, and yet she regarded me as though I were less than the strangers offering her sympathy. That was the cruelty of her coldness, not the absence of affection alone, but the presence of something colder, harder, a judgment that weighed heavier than the dirt upon her mother's grave. I wanted to believe it was grief speaking through her, that with time her heart would soften, but deep down I feared this was not temporary. This was who she had become, and I was left standing in the shadow of her distance, clutching memories of a little girl who no longer existed. As I stood there in the emptiness of my own grief, watching my daughter turn away from me as though I were nothing more than a bystander at my wife's funeral, memories of sacrifice rose unbidden, flooding me with the sharp ache of years that could not be forgotten no matter how hard she tried to erase them. I remembered the nights when she was a child and sleep was a stranger to us both, her tiny cries echoing through the small house while I cradled her in weary arms, pacing the worn floors until dawn painted the windows. And though my body begged for rest, I never once faltered, because her peace mattered more than mine. I remembered the mornings when I would leave before the sun climbed the sky, pulling on boots heavy with mud and work, my stomach empty because there was only enough food for her breakfast, and I would whisper promises to myself that one day she would never know the hunger I had endured. I remembered the winters, when the cold seeped into my bones because I had given her my coat, wrapping her in warmth while I braced against the bitter winds. And though my hands cracked and bled from the chill, I felt a pride that outshone any discomfort because she was safe. I remembered the birthdays when money was scarce, but I found a way, working extra shifts, collecting scraps of overtime, selling tools I thought I would need, all so she could open a gift with eyes wide in delight, never knowing the cost of that joy, never seeing the sacrifices that lay behind it. I remembered the years when her education became the center of my world, when every paycheck was carved into tuition and books, when I denied myself even the smallest pleasures, no new clothes, no hot meals at lunch, just so she could walk into classrooms with dignity, her head held high among children who never knew what it meant to go without. I remembered the car she drove when she turned 16, the one I bought with hands blistered from extra shifts, a car she treated as her ticket to freedom, never once acknowledging that her freedom was purchased with my sweat. I remembered the nights when I came home too tired to stand, my body aching from long hours, yet I still found the strength to sit beside her and help with homework, to listen to her dreams of a life brighter than the one we lived, and I believed in those dreams with all my heart, even if it meant burying my own. I remembered the countless moments when I swallowed pride, endured ridicule, allowed others to think me lesser, all because I wanted her to feel she was greater, and through it all I thought she understood, I thought she saw. I thought one day she would look back and realize that everything she had was built on the back of a man who never once stopped loving her. Yet, as I stood in that church and felt her coldness pierce me like ice, I realized that somewhere along the line she had not only forgotten but chosen to forget, chosen to rewrite her story in a way that erased me, painting herself as self-made and me as a shadow best left behind. That was the cruelest cut of all. Not the words she spoke, not the way she turned her eyes away, but the knowledge that all the sacrifices I had made had become invisible in her heart, invisible in her mind, as though the years I gave had never existed. Still, I could not bring myself to regret them, for sacrifice born of love is never wasted, even if it is never acknowledged. My wife knew. She always knew. And it was her quiet gratitude, her gentle hand on mine, her whispered reassurances late at night that told me my efforts had not been in vain. She saw me, she valued me, and though my daughter's coldness left me shattered, I held on to that truth, because without it the weight of sacrifice would have crushed me long ago. In that moment, standing in the shadow of her disdain, I whispered to myself that love is not measured by recognition, that the greatest sacrifices are often unseen. But I also knew that life has a way of revealing truths when least expected, and though my daughter dismissed me now, the day would come when she could no longer deny the foundation upon which her life had been built. The humiliation came not in a whisper, but in the open air of the gathering that followed the service. When the mourners had moved into the hall to share coffee and food, their voices low but their eyes sharp, and I stood quietly in the corner with a paper cup that shook faintly in my hand. I had hoped to disappear into the background, to let others speak of my wife and find comfort in memories, but my daughter made sure that even in death I could not escape her scorn. She approached me with a stiffness that turned every head, her heels striking the polished floor like gavel blows. Her chin lifted in a way that told the room she was preparing to make a point. I braced myself, hoping she would simply pass by, but instead she stopped in front of me, and in a voice that carried far beyond our circle, she told me plainly that I should leave. Her words were not dressed in courtesy or softened by grief. They were sharp, unyielding, meant to cut deep and to signal to everyone present that I was no longer part of her world. For a moment silence fell across the room, the kind of silence that pricks at the skin, a silence filled with unspoken judgments and hidden smirks. I saw the glances, the quickly averted eyes, the uncomfortable shifting of feet, as relatives and friends tried to look anywhere but at me. Some pitied me. Others seemed to agree with her, but none spoke. I stood frozen, her words echoing in my ears louder than the murmurs that followed, and I felt the blood rush to my face, my hands clenching around the flimsy cup until it crumpled in my grip. She had taken from me not only dignity, but belonging. To be told in front of everyone that I no longer had a place in the family was a blow worse than any insult whispered behind my back. This was not a private scolding, not the quiet sting of rejection, but a declaration delivered like a verdict in front of a jury of my peers. I looked at her face, searching for any trace of hesitation, any flicker of the little girl who once clung to my hand, but all I saw was a cold certainty, a determination to erase me. I wanted to respond, to defend myself, to remind her of every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment of devotion that had shaped her life, but my throat closed and no words came. It was as though grief and shame had bound me in chains, leaving me powerless. The room seemed to grow smaller, the walls pressing in, the air thick with the scent of coffee and pastries that now turned bitter in my mouth. I could feel eyes boring into me, measuring me, deciding what kind of man I must have been to deserve such treatment. And in their silence, I felt judged, condemned, abandoned. My wife had always told me to stand tall, to remember that dignity is not given but carried within. Yet in that moment, I felt stripped of it, left exposed in front of those who had once called me friend, brother, cousin. My daughter turned on her heel after delivering her command, not waiting for my answer, confident that I would obey, and the sound of her departure was like the closing of a door that might never open again. I remained standing, my legs trembling, my chest heavy with shame that burned hotter than the grief of loss. I thought of walking out immediately, sparing myself further humiliation, but I hesitated, torn between the desire to cling to the memory of my wife among those who had come to honor her and the pull of my daughter's rejection that screamed, I no longer belonged. That hesitation was its own humiliation, the pause of a man who no longer knew where he was allowed to stand. In that moment I realized that humiliation is not simply the sting of insult. It is the weight of being made invisible in the very space where you should matter most. It was the cruelest part of all, to be erased in the presence of people who had once witnessed my devotion, my sacrifices, my loyalty. As the chatter resumed and people deliberately avoided my gaze, I felt smaller, reduced to a shadow of the man I once was. And though my body remained in that room, my spirit was already retreating, curling inward, waiting for the chance to escape. The silence of the crowd that day was louder than any shout. and it haunts me more than my daughter's cruel words, because silence from those who know you, who have shared meals at your table, who have smiled at you in better days, carries a betrayal all its own. When she told me to leave, her voice sharp enough to cut through the air, I waited, almost desperately, for someone to speak, for a single voice to rise in protest, to say that a grieving widower should not be cast aside on the very day he buried his wife. But no such voice came. Instead, there was a shifting of feet, a lowering of eyes, and a sudden fascination with teacups and pastry plates, as though every guest had been struck blind and mute. My brothers-in-law, men who once leaned on me when they could not pay their bills, looked down at their shoes. Old friends who had laughed beside me on summer evenings cleared their throats and pretended to cough. Even the priest, who had just spoken of compassion and unity, busied himself with a tray of untouched sandwiches, his head bowed in studied avoidance. I could hear the nervous rustling of coats, the clinking of cups hastily set down, and I could feel the weight of eyes sneaking glances at me, not out of support but out of morbid curiosity, as if watching how a man crumbles might be more entertaining than stepping in to steady him. It was not just their silence. It was their complicity, the way they created a wall of indifference that left me standing exposed, stripped of dignity. I thought of the favors I had done for so many of them over the years, the times I had driven through the night to lend a hand, the money I had lent without ever asking for repayment, the trust I had extended when no one else would. I thought of the countless sacrifices I had made, not just for my daughter, but for the family that now sat in judgment by their silence. And I realized in that moment that gratitude is a fleeting thing, that loyalty is as fragile as glass, and that when one person chooses to cast you out, the rest will often follow, too fearful or too self-serving to take your side. My daughter's voice had set the tone, and the crowd followed it like sheep, their silence becoming an unspoken verdict that I did not belong. I stood there, humiliated, waiting for a single hand to touch my shoulder, a single word of kindness to bridge the gap, but none came. The air was thick with discomfort, the kind that makes people shift in their chairs and whisper once you leave, but not one of them risked breaking the stillness to defend me. In that suffocating quiet, I learned something about people I had long suspected but never wanted to admit. When the world turns against you, most will not fight for you. They will simply stand back and watch. The sting of my daughter's rejection was deep, but the sting of their silence was deeper, for it confirmed that I was utterly alone. My wife had always said that true friends reveal themselves in hard times, and looking around that room I saw clearly who was true and who was not. The same relatives who had once toasted me at family gatherings now sipped their drinks with downcast eyes. The same neighbors who had borrowed my tools, who had shared my firewood in winters past, now folded their arms and looked away. I felt invisible and yet too visible at the same time, like a spectacle they wanted to end quickly so they could return to comfortable conversation. I wondered if any of them thought of my wife in that moment, of what she would have wanted, of how she would have wept to see her husband pushed aside on the day meant to honor her life. But their silence told me that her wishes no longer mattered, only appearances did, only the comfort of not becoming involved. I stood there, a man surrounded by people, and yet utterly alone, the murmur of voices gradually returning, as though my humiliation had been absorbed into the air. And as I turned my eyes to the floor, shame pressing hard against my chest, I understood that sometimes the loudest betrayal is not spoken in words, but delivered in silence. The walk away from that hall was the longest and heaviest journey of my life. Though the distance was only a few short steps to the door, because each step carried not just the weight of my grief, but the crushing burden of humiliation and betrayal. My daughter's words still rang in my ears, her command that I should leave echoing louder than the hymns that had filled the church, and the silence of the crowd pressed on my back like an invisible hand pushing me out. I lowered my gaze to avoid the stares I knew were following me. Stares that judged, stares that pitied, stares that enjoyed the spectacle of an old man cast aside, and though no one spoke, I could feel their thoughts filling the room like smoke. My hands trembled as I reached for my coat, the fabric heavy in my grip, and for a moment I lingered, hoping against all hope that someone, anyone, would stop me, would say that I belonged, that I was her husband, that I had every right to stand in that hall and mourn my wife. But no voice came. No hand touched my arm, and so I straightened myself as best I could, though my shoulders sagged under sorrow, and I began the painful walk toward the door. Each step felt like a betrayal of my wife, as though by leaving I was abandoning her memory. Yet to stay would have been to endure more humiliation, and I could not bear another lash of my daughter's cold tongue. I thought of the years when we had walked side by side into gatherings, her hand on my arm, her smile lighting every room, and how proud I had been to stand beside her. Now I walked alone, my footsteps echoing in the hall, each one a reminder that the world I knew had ended with her last breath. As I passed the tables where families sat with bowed heads, I saw the flickers of shame in their eyes, the discomfort of those who knew they should speak, but chose silence instead. Their silence was worse than open cruelty, because it told me I was not worth the risk of their loyalty. When I reached the door, the cold air rushed in, and it struck me like a second blow, sharper than the first, for it carried with it the truth that I was no longer welcome among my own blood. I stepped outside, and the world felt different, harsher, stripped of warmth. The sky was gray, the wind unforgiving, and I pulled my coat tight around me as though it could shield me from the ache inside. I walked slowly down the steps, each one heavier than the last, and when I reached the bottom, I turned for one final look at the building behind me. The church stood tall and silent, its windows glowing faintly with the light of candles, but it no longer felt like a place of sanctuary. It felt like a place of exile. I thought of my wife's coffin, now lowered into the earth, and I whispered an apology to her for leaving, for walking away when I should have stood stronger, though I knew she would understand, for she always understood the limits of a man's strength. The sound of laughter drifted faintly from inside the hall, a cruel reminder that life continued without me, that even on this day people found reasons to smile while I carried only sorrow. My footsteps crunched against the gravel as I made my way to the road, each one echoing the hollow rhythm of my heart. The walk was painful, not only because of what had just happened, but because of what it meant. It meant that my role as father had been diminished to nothing, that the man who had given everything was now dismissed, that my place in my daughter's life had been replaced by contempt. It meant that I was not only a widower, but an outcast. And yet, as I walked away with the weight of humiliation pressing down, there was a small flicker of resolve deep within me, fragile but undeniable, a whisper that told me this was not the end of my story, that one day truth would rise from the ashes of shame, and when it did, those who watched me walk away in silence would remember the moment they let me fall. The days that followed my wife's funeral blurred into a fog of sorrow, and I moved through them like a man half alive, each morning heavy with the ache of her absence, and each night colder without her warmth beside me. The house was unbearably silent, every corner echoing with memories I could not escape. And though I tried to fill the hours with small tasks, I found myself sitting in her chair, staring at her favorite teacup, tracing my fingers along the grooves of the life we had built together. I thought often of my daughter, of the cruelty in her eyes, of the humiliation she had forced upon me, and though my heart longed to forgive, the wound was too raw, too deep, leaving me restless and ashamed. It was in the middle of this fog, when I felt most invisible, that a letter arrived, its envelope heavy with formality, its seal stamped with the name of the lawyer who had long handled our family affairs. At first I stared at it without opening, for my heart could not bear another reminder of finality, but eventually I tore it open, my fingers trembling as though they already knew it contained more than mere words. Inside was a summons, a request for my presence at the reading of my wife's will. The date was set, the time precise, and as I read the formal lines, my chest tightened with dread and anticipation alike. I knew what such meetings meant. They were final acts, closures etched in ink, the dividing of a life's work into papers and possessions, and I was not sure if I had the strength to sit in a room where my daughter would surely sit across from me, cold and distant as she had been in the church. Yet part of me clung to the letter, holding it like a lifeline, for it meant my wife still had something to say, her voice reaching out from beyond the grave to guide the world she had left behind. I folded the letter carefully, almost reverently, and placed it on the table, staring at it as though it were a message not from a lawyer but from her. That night I slept little, my dreams tangled with memories of her laughter, the softness of her touch, the way she looked at me when she thought no one was watching. I wondered what words she had left behind, whether she had thought of me in those final weeks, whether she had known how fractured our family had become. The day of the summons came quickly, the hours dragging and yet racing all at once, and I dressed with more care than I had in days, combing my thinning hair, straightening the same black suit I had worn to her funeral, as though by presenting myself with dignity I could honor her one last time. As I walked to the lawyer's office, the city moved around me in a blur, strangers bustling about their lives, unaware that for me this day carried the weight of a final chapter. The building loomed ahead, tall and impersonal, its glass doors reflecting a man I barely recognized, stooped with sorrow but standing nonetheless. Inside, the air was crisp, the scent of polished wood and old paper filling my lungs, and I gave my name at the desk with a voice that wavered slightly, but did not break. The clerk nodded, her eyes kind but detached, and directed me to the waiting room where chairs lined the walls and a clock ticked with unbearable precision. I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap, listening to the hollow sound of footsteps in the hall, each one bringing me closer to the moment I both feared and needed. I knew my daughter would be there, and I braced myself for her scorn, for the inevitable glares, for the whispers of entitlement that would cross her lips. Yet above all that fear was a strange calm, born of the thought that whatever my wife had written, it would be her truth, her voice unshaken by influence or intimidation. It was the lawyer's summons that had pulled me from despair and placed me on this path, and as I waited, staring at the closed door to the office, I whispered silently to her memory that I was here, that I was ready, that I would listen to whatever final words she had chosen to leave behind. The gathering at the lawyer's office was unlike any family gathering I had known, for there was no warmth of shared meals or laughter of familiar voices, only the sterile air of legal formality and the cold anticipation of inheritance. I arrived early, choosing a seat near the corner of the long wooden table, hoping to anchor myself with quiet dignity while I waited for the others to arrive. The office smelled faintly of leather and old books, and the blinds filtered the sunlight into pale stripes across the polished floor, casting shadows that seemed to stretch longer with every passing minute. I sat with my hands folded tightly in my lap, the letter of summons still tucked in my coat pocket like a final message from my wife, and I thought of her handwriting on birthday cards, her careful notes left for me on the kitchen counter, the tenderness with which she had always spoken. I wanted to believe that even in this moment her presence lingered, guiding me through what felt like a battlefield disguised as a conference room. The door opened, and my daughter entered with an air of confidence that belonged more to a conqueror than a mourner. She wore a sleek black dress, her hair styled immaculately. Her lips painted a shade that suggested control rather than sorrow, and she carried herself as though the entire proceeding was merely a formality to confirm what she already believed was hers. Her eyes flickered to me briefly, sharp and dismissive, before she chose a seat directly opposite mine at the table, placing her handbag beside her with a decisive thud that echoed louder than it should have. The room seemed to shift with her arrival, tension filling the space like smoke, and I could feel the eyes of distant relatives and family friends who trickled in after her, glancing from her to me with uncertainty. Some nodded politely in my direction, but their gestures were fleeting, shallow, as though afraid that showing me kindness might offend her. The lawyer entered last, a solemn man with graying hair and a calm voice, his suit perfectly pressed, his eyes betraying the weight of the task he carried. He greeted the room with professional courtesy, his tone firm and neutral, and as he sat at the head of the table, I noticed how his gaze lingered on me for a moment, longer than on anyone else. A flicker of recognition, perhaps even sympathy. My daughter leaned forward eagerly, her hands clasped as though ready to receive her prize, and her confidence was almost suffocating. I could see it in her posture, in the smug curve of her mouth, in the way she tapped her manicured nails lightly against the table while the lawyer arranged his papers. She believed without question that the estate, the house, the savings, the years of toil that my wife and I had built together were all about to be handed to her without contest. For her, this was not grief, but triumph. She looked around at the others in the room with a subtle smirk, as if daring them to challenge what she saw as inevitable. I sat silently, my chest heavy with a mixture of sorrow and dread, yet beneath it all a small ember of resolve glowed, though I did not yet know why. I had not come expecting anything but confirmation of my invisibility, expecting to be overlooked once again, perhaps left with nothing more than a token reminder of the life I had shared with my wife. Still, as I studied the lawyer's careful movements, the way he unfolded the papers with precision, the way his brow furrowed slightly before he spoke, I sensed that the air was thicker than my daughter realized. The gathering at that table was not just a formality. It was a moment suspended between expectation and revelation, and though my daughter radiated certainty, I felt something shifting beneath the surface, a current moving unseen. My heart pounded as the lawyer cleared his throat, his voice calm but carrying the weight of finality as he prepared to read words that would not only close a chapter but open another. And in that instant, I understood that whatever was written on those pages would change everything, for better or for worse. As I sat there in that office, the lawyer shuffling his papers and my daughter practically vibrating with greedy anticipation, my mind drifted away from the present and carried me back to the memories of devotion that had defined my life with my wife, memories that came in waves so vivid I could almost hear her voice again. I remembered the earliest years of our marriage, when we had almost nothing but love and determination, when the tiny apartment we called home shook with the rumble of the train outside but felt like a palace because we had each other. I remembered the mornings when she would rise early to make me coffee even though she had worked late the night before, her eyes tired but her smile gentle, and the way she pressed a kiss to my cheek as I left for work. A ritual so small yet so powerful that it carried me through the longest days. I remembered the nights we would sit side by side at the kitchen table, counting every coin and every bill, wondering how we would stretch what little we had to cover rent, groceries, and the needs of our daughter. Yet through it all, she never once complained. Her strength was quiet, steadfast, and it was her devotion that kept me from collapsing under the weight of responsibility. I remembered the times I came home broken, shoulders aching from work, hands blistered, spirit weary, and how she would take those same battered hands into hers, smoothing them with her touch, whispering that I was enough, that I was doing more than any man could, and though I doubted myself often, I never doubted her love. I remembered the way she looked at our daughter, her eyes glowing with pride and tenderness, and the way she would turn to me with that same look, silently reminding me that we had built something beautiful together. I remembered her laughter, bright and unrestrained, filling the house with warmth, especially on nights when storms rattled the windows and bills threatened to break us, laughter that reminded me that joy could be found even in hardship. I remembered the hospital room where she gave birth, her face pale with exhaustion yet radiant with triumph as she cradled our child, and the way she whispered that she could not have done it without me, though I knew it was her courage that carried us both. I remembered the long walks we took after work, when we could spare the time, holding hands like young lovers even as years passed. Speaking of dreams and futures that often felt out of reach, but somehow closer when spoken aloud. I remembered how she always defended me when others questioned my worth, how she told relatives who judged my modest earnings that I was a man of honor, a man who worked tirelessly, a man who put his family above all else. Her devotion was not loud or boastful. It was woven into the fabric of every day, in the meals she cooked, in the patience she showed, in the way she never let me forget that I mattered. Even in her final years, when illness began to weaken her body, she never let it weaken her spirit, and she would often reach for my hand, squeeze it, and say that she was proud that I had given her a life filled with love. Those memories wrapped around me in that sterile office like a cloak, protecting me from the coldness of my daughter's stare, reminding me that no matter how she treated me, no matter how invisible she tried to make me, my wife had seen me fully. She had known my worth, cherished my devotion, and carried it with her to her final breath. As the lawyer prepared to speak, I sat quietly, letting those memories strengthen me. For I knew that whatever was written on those pages, whatever truth was about to be revealed, it would bear the mark of her love, her devotion, and her unwavering recognition of the man I truly was. My daughter's anticipation in that office was so thick it seemed to fill the air, pressing against me from across the table as I sat quietly in my chair. She leaned forward with her elbows resting delicately on the polished wood, her eyes gleaming with expectation, her lips curved in a smile that betrayed more greed than grief. The lawyer had not yet spoken a word of the will, yet she acted as though everything had already been secured, as though the estate, the house, the savings, and every last piece of my wife's devotion were hers by default. I watched her tap her manicured nails against the table in a steady rhythm, a little drumbeat of impatience, and it made me ache to think how far she had drifted from the child she once was. She had not always been like this. There was a time when she had been soft and full of wonder, when she would sit on my knee and listen to stories with wide eyes, when she looked at the world as though it was a place filled with endless possibility. Somewhere along the way, that innocence had hardened into entitlement, and as I studied her in that moment, I wondered when exactly the shift had happened. Her posture was rigid but proud, her chin tilted slightly upward in a manner that made her appear as though she was surveying subjects rather than sitting among family. The other relatives seemed to sense her confidence too, for their glances darted to her often, some with approval, others with envy, but none daring to question her certainty. She greeted their looks with a faint nod or a subtle smirk, as if she was already basking in the role of the one who would inherit the legacy of the woman we all mourned. I felt invisible in that room. Not because the lawyer ignored me, but because my daughter had already decided I no longer mattered, that I was merely a placeholder in a story that belonged to her now. I could almost hear the thoughts running through her mind as she sat there, plotting how she would spend the money, what she would do with the house, how she would carry herself in society once the estate was under her control. Her anticipation was not the quiet, humble hope of a grieving child wishing for her mother's last blessing. It was a hunger, sharp and unyielding, a hunger that consumed the space between us and made me feel like an obstacle rather than a father. I wondered if she even remembered her mother's devotion, if she recalled the nights her mother sat awake sewing her clothes, the sacrifices we both made to ensure she had everything she needed. I wondered if she remembered the gentle voice that always told her to be kind, to be grateful, to value love above wealth. Judging by the gleam in her eyes, I doubted it. The anticipation on her face was not shaped by love, but by greed, and it saddened me more than her coldness at the funeral, because it showed me that even in death her mother's lessons had been cast aside. The lawyer cleared his throat, shuffling the papers with deliberate care, and I noticed how my daughter leaned even closer, her breath quickening slightly, as though she could not bear to wait another moment. She had built a fortress of expectation so high that nothing could penetrate it, and I feared for what would happen when it crumbled. For as I watched her sitting there, her entire body radiating certainty, I realized that she had no doubt in her mind that everything was about to fall neatly into her hands. She anticipated victory, not realizing that the very words she was about to hear would shatter her confidence and reveal the truth of who her mother truly valued. I sat silently, folding my hands tighter, bracing myself for the storm I knew was coming, but still watching her with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief, unable to reconcile the daughter I had raised with the woman sitting across from me who waited like a predator for her inheritance to be delivered. The lawyer's voice finally broke the tense silence of the room, steady yet carrying a weight that seemed to hush even the faint tapping of my daughter's nails against the polished table. And as he began to speak, there came an unexpected pause that changed the air completely. He unfolded the document slowly, his eyes scanning the words as though he were measuring them carefully before allowing them to escape his lips. And then he looked up, not at my daughter as she clearly expected, but directly at me. That look was brief, perhaps only a few seconds, yet it carried so much meaning that my chest tightened and my breath caught. My daughter shifted in her seat, confused by the delay, her smile faltering slightly as she leaned even closer, as if to drag the words from him by force. I watched her eyes flash with impatience, but the lawyer held firm, keeping the room suspended in a silence that grew heavier by the second. It was not the silence of indifference I had felt at the funeral, nor the silence of judgment I had endured among relatives, but a silence heavy with anticipation, a silence that told me something was about to be revealed that no one in that room expected. My daughter's certainty began to crack, though she tried to mask it with an impatient clearing of her throat, a tightening of her jaw, the flicker of her fingers adjusting her handbag. Still, the pause lingered. I could feel every heartbeat echoing in my chest, a drum against the stillness, and I wondered what the lawyer had seen in the words before him, what truth he was preparing to release that required such careful handling. My wife's voice seemed to whisper in my memory then, her calm reassurances that she knew my worth, that she saw what others chose not to see, and I felt a tremor of hope stir within me, though I dared not grasp it fully. The lawyer took a deep breath, folded his hands on the table, and for a moment his gaze softened, as if to prepare me for the blow or the blessing that was about to fall. My daughter could not contain her impatience any longer, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, as she asked if he would please proceed, her tone edged with irritation that betrayed the cracks forming in her composure. The lawyer nodded slowly, as though acknowledging her demand, yet, before speaking again, he let his eyes return to me, as if to anchor himself in the truth of the man my wife had entrusted him to honor. The pause stretched into eternity in my mind, a single moment expanding until it felt as though the entire world held its breath. I glanced around the table and saw the confusion growing in the faces of the other relatives, their eyes darting from the lawyer to my daughter to me, sensing the shift but not understanding it. For me, that pause was not just hesitation, it was revelation in itself. The first sign that perhaps the story would not unfold the way my daughter believed. It was as though my wife had reached from beyond the grave to slow time, to make sure that the weight of her words would fall with precision, leaving no room for misunderstanding. The lawyer cleared his throat again, adjusted his glasses, and in that small pause before he finally began to read, I felt a surge of strength rise within me. My humiliation at the funeral, my painful walk away, the silence of the crowd, all of it condensed into this single breath before truth emerged. And though my daughter fidgeted with restless confidence, convinced that fortune was only seconds away from being laid at her feet, I sat quietly with a growing awareness that something extraordinary was about to unfold, something that would remind the room, and my daughter most of all, that devotion does not die with silence, that love leaves its mark even in the ink of a will. The shock came the moment the lawyer's voice steadied and the words left his lips, words that sliced through my daughter's expectations and shattered the smug certainty that had wrapped her like armor. For instead of declaring her the sole heir, as she had imagined, he announced that the majority of my wife's estate, the house, the savings, the investments, and the very legacy she left behind, had been entrusted to me. The room gasped as though a storm had broken through the windows, and I saw my daughter's face twist in disbelief, her carefully constructed composure collapsing in an instant as her mouth fell open and her eyes widened with a horror she could not conceal. She had leaned so far forward in anticipation that when the truth struck, she nearly toppled, her hands gripping the edge of the table with such force that her knuckles whitened. For a moment there was silence, not the expectant silence of before, but a stunned, breathless silence, as every relative, every friend, every witness in that office turned their gaze from the lawyer to me, their eyes filled with shock, confusion, and something else I had not felt in years, respect. I sat motionless, my heart pounding in my chest, scarcely able to believe the words myself, yet in the same breath I felt the presence of my wife, her voice echoing softly in my memory, reminding me that she had always seen my worth even when others had chosen not to. My daughter shook her head violently, her voice rising in protest, demanding that there must have been a mistake, her words stumbling over themselves in desperation. But the lawyer held his ground, his voice calm and firm, as he repeated the clauses of the will, each one another blow against her arrogance. I saw her eyes dart from the papers to me, her expression wild, as though searching for some hidden explanation, some secret scheme that could explain how her world had just collapsed. Her disbelief quickly curdled into rage, her face reddening, her lips trembling as she muttered accusations under her breath, but the truth stood unshaken in the lawyer's voice. Around the table, Whispers spread, some gasps giving way to murmurs, the kind that rise when long-held assumptions crumble before undeniable fact. I caught the eyes of a cousin who had ignored me at the funeral, and he quickly looked away, ashamed. And in that moment I realized that the humiliation I had endured was being quietly rewritten. My daughter's shock was not just personal, it was public, and the room bore witness to her downfall as much as it bore witness to my vindication. Still, I did not move, I did not gloat, I did not even allow a smile to cross my face, for this was not a victory born of pride but of love, of my wife's final act of devotion. Yet within me, beneath the layers of sorrow and restraint, there stirred a deep, quiet vindication that no words could capture. My daughter, who had cast me aside at the funeral, who had spoken of me as though I were worthless, now sat in front of me stripped of her certainty, her shock, exposing the fragile truth that without her mother's blessing, she stood with nothing. I wanted to reach across the years, to remind her of the father who had carried her, the man who had sacrificed for her. But I knew that this was not a lesson that could be taught with words. This was a lesson only truth could deliver, and truth had arrived in the form of her mother's will. The shock on her face was not only disbelief, but the dawning realization that the story she had told herself, the one where I no longer mattered, had been a lie all along, and though she tried to mask it with anger, the room had already seen the collapse of her arrogance. When the lawyer continued after the initial shock had settled, his voice softened, and he explained that my wife had left not only instructions about the division of her estate, but also a final message, words she had written herself, sealed and preserved to be spoken aloud in that very room. And as he unfolded the separate page and began to read, the air grew so still that I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. My heart trembled as though she were about to step back into the world. Her voice carried through him, and I gripped the arms of my chair as if to anchor myself to the moment. The lawyer read her words slowly, deliberately, honoring each syllable, and what I heard pierced me with both sorrow and strength. She wrote that throughout her life she had been blessed with many things, but above all she had been blessed with a husband who never faltered, a man who had stood beside her when days were dark, who had carried burdens without complaint, who had given everything he had so that their family could thrive. She wrote that love is not measured by wealth or by appearances, but by loyalty, sacrifice, and quiet devotion, and she wished to honor that truth in her final act. She declared in her letter that the estate should belong to the one who had built it with her, who had worked hand in hand through every struggle, who had never abandoned her or turned away, and that was me, her husband, her partner, her companion in all things. As the lawyer spoke her words, I felt tears burn at the corners of my eyes, not from the inheritance she had left, but from the recognition that she had seen me, truly seen me, when so many others had chosen to look away. The room was silent. As those words filled the air, a silence of awe now rather than indifference, and I noticed how some relatives shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had judged me too quickly, too harshly, while my daughter's face twisted with disbelief and fury. The lawyer continued, reading the part where my wife addressed our daughter directly, her tone firm yet sorrowful, saying that while she loved her child deeply, she could not ignore the disrespect and coldness that had grown between them, and she hoped that one day her daughter would learn that love and loyalty matter more than entitlement or greed. Hearing those words spoken aloud was like feeling my wife's spirit step into the room, defending me even from beyond the grave, making sure that truth was spoken where I had been silenced. I lowered my head, letting the tears fall quietly, remembering every moment of our shared life, every night, She had reassured me when I doubted myself, every sacrifice we had made together, and realizing that this final letter was her way of protecting me even after death. Around the table, no one spoke. The lawyer's voice carried the weight of her love, her final testament, and when he finished, the paper in his hand seemed to glow with power greater than any contract, greater than any possession. My daughter slammed her fist against the table, shaking her head violently, muttering that it could not be real, that her mother would never have written such words, but her denial could not erase the truth. The lawyer held up the signed, notarized page, the undeniable mark of authenticity, and declared firmly that these were her words, her will, her choice. In that moment I felt vindicated, not by wealth, not by legal terms, but by love that had endured through every trial, love that had spoken even when I could not, love that proved I had not been invisible to the one who mattered most. The moment the lawyer finished reading my wife's final words, the silence shattered beneath the weight of my daughter's outburst, an explosion of fury that startled even those who had sat stiffly through every revelation up until then. She rose from her chair so quickly it scraped across the polished floor with a shriek, her fists clenched, her face burning red as though the fire inside her could consume the entire room. She shouted that it was impossible, that her mother would never have written such words, that I must have manipulated the lawyer, bribed him, twisted the truth in some devious scheme to steal what was rightfully hers. Her accusations poured out in a torrent, each word sharper than the last, her voice trembling not with sorrow but with rage, and the relatives around the table recoiled at the spectacle, their eyes wide with disbelief as the young woman they once admired revealed herself stripped of composure. She pounded her fist against the documents, demanding that they be examined, that they be proven false, that there must be some mistake, some forgery, anything to explain how her certainty had crumbled in an instant. The lawyer remained calm, his voice steady, as he assured her that every page was legitimate, every signature verified, every line beyond question, but she would not hear it. She turned her fury on me then, pointing her finger with trembling rage, her words dripping venom as she accused me of stealing her future, of poisoning her mother against her, of plotting all along to make her feel abandoned. I sat silently, my hands folded, my heart pounding, but I did not respond, for I knew that no words of mine could cut through the storm of her anger, and the lawyer's documents spoke louder than any defense I could offer. She grew more frantic with each passing second, pacing the length of the table, her heels striking the floor like thunder, her voice rising until it nearly cracked. She demanded that the others speak, that they support her, that they deny what they had just heard, but no one moved, no one dared to echo her accusations, and in their silence she found no allies. That only enraged her further, her voice breaking into a shrill cry as she shouted that it was unfair, that she had earned it, that she deserved it all, and I watched as her mask of composure disintegrated before the entire room. The very arrogance that had carried her into the office now betrayed her, for in her outburst she revealed the truth of her greed, the raw selfishness that my wife had so clearly seen. Relatives who had once looked at her with admiration now averted their eyes, their respect dissolving with each frantic word she uttered. I could feel my wife's presence in that moment, her wisdom echoing in the words the lawyer had read, and I knew she had predicted this very reaction, had known that her daughter's entitlement would not vanish quietly, but would expose itself when faced with the undeniable truth. I sat still, a statue of silence, letting her rage fill the room, for I understood that sometimes silence is stronger than confrontation, and in my stillness I held a dignity she could not touch. Her voice cracked finally. her tears spilling not from grief but from fury, and she collapsed back into her chair, shaking her head, muttering curses under her breath, while the lawyer calmly gathered the papers and reminded her that the law was absolute, that nothing she said could change the will her mother had left behind. The outburst had stripped her bare, revealing her heart to everyone present, and though it broke me to see how far she had fallen, it also vindicated me in ways I had never thought possible. For in her tantrum, the room saw the truth, the same truth my wife had known, that love cannot be demanded, that respect cannot be forced, and that entitlement has no place in the legacy of a woman who valued loyalty above all else. In the wake of my daughter's furious eruption, when her shouts still clung to the walls of the lawyer's office like smoke after a fire, I chose silence. A silence not born of weakness but of strength, for I knew that nothing I could say would calm her storm or change her heart in that moment. I sat still in my chair, my hands folded gently before me, my eyes lowered not in shame but in quiet restraint, and I let her words echo into emptiness until they lost their power. Around me, the others sat frozen, their faces tense, their bodies stiff, waiting perhaps for me to retaliate, to shout back, to defend myself against her accusations, but I remained unmoved. I remembered the lessons of my wife, her belief that dignity was never found in shouting matches or in proving yourself to those unwilling to see, but in carrying yourself with patience, letting truth speak where words fail. So I let her rage stand against the calm of my silence, and slowly the balance of the room began to shift. Her voice, raw and frantic, had shown the depths of her greed, while my stillness stood as proof that her accusations were empty. I heard her muttering still, whispering curses under her breath, insisting that the will was false, but each time her voice cracked, and each time it faltered, it sounded smaller, weaker, less convincing. My silence became a mirror in which her outburst reflected, and those watching saw her not as a victim, but as the architect of her own disgrace. I sat remembering all the times I had spoken too quickly in the past, when anger had clouded my judgment, when frustration had driven me to words I later regretted, and I realized that this moment required none of that. This moment required stillness, the kind of quiet that speaks louder than any argument. My daughter glared at me, her eyes demanding a response, desperate for me to break my composure so she could paint herself the wounded one. But I gave her nothing. I gave her only the steady presence of a father who had weathered storms far greater than her tantrum, a man who knew that truth did not need defending when it already stood tall in the lawyer's documents and in the words of his wife. I thought then of my wife's message, the letter she had left behind, the recognition of my devotion, the acknowledgement of my sacrifices, and I felt her strength flow into me as though she were sitting beside me, her hand resting lightly on mine, whispering that I need not fight because she had already fought for me. My silence was not an absence of voice, but a continuation of hers. It was a way of honoring her, of letting her final words ring without interruption, without being muddied by the noise of conflict. The relatives began to shift again, their eyes moving from my daughter's flushed face to my calm stillness, and I saw their expressions soften toward me, their pity replaced with respect, their uncertainty giving way to understanding. They saw the contrast as clearly as I felt it, and in their silence I found allies where before I had found none. My daughter finally slumped back into her chair, defeated not by my words but by my lack of them, her anger turning inward, her mutters now incoherent, as though even she could no longer believe her claims. The lawyer resumed his reading, his tone even, steady, professional, but the room itself had already shifted. The tide had turned not because I shouted louder, but because I remained still, and in that stillness the truth of my wife's love, her recognition of my worth, became undeniable. My silence had become my voice, and though my daughter fumed, the rest of the room saw clearly the difference between a man who carried himself with dignity and a woman who had allowed greed to consume her. In that moment, I realized that silence, when chosen wisely, is not emptiness, it is power. The lawyer, steady and unshaken by my daughter's tantrum, leaned forward with the calm authority of a man who had anticipated every protest and prepared for every challenge, and he began to explain the legal ironclad strength of my wife's will. His voice carried no malice, no judgment, only the firm clarity of fact, yet each word landed like a hammer against my daughter's frantic denials. He laid out the details one by one, citing dates, signatures, witnesses, and notarizations, leaving no space for doubt or loophole. He explained that my wife had drafted the will with great care, consulting with him over multiple sessions, ensuring that her intentions were not only clear but protected from dispute. He produced documents, each stamped and signed, proof that every step had been taken to secure her wishes beyond challenge. My daughter's face paled as he unfolded each page, her bravado shrinking under the weight of evidence that no fury could erase. He explained that the bulk of the estate was placed directly in my name, not in trust, not in conditional terms, but with absolute ownership, meaning I alone would decide how it was to be used. He clarified that my daughter was left with only a token inheritance, a modest sum and a few sentimental items, enough to show she had not been forgotten, but not enough to grant her the power she craved. The lawyer emphasized that this was intentional, deliberate, and unshakable, crafted to withstand any legal contest. He spoke of clauses designed specifically to prevent disputes, clauses that made it clear that should she attempt to challenge the will in court, she would forfeit even the token gifts she had been given. Each explanation tightened the cage around her protest, and though she tried to interject with angry interruptions, he continued calmly, allowing her words to collapse against the wall of legal certainty. I sat quietly, listening, each phrase like a balm to the wound she had inflicted on me at the funeral. For here was proof that my wife had not only loved me, but protected me with foresight, ensuring that her final act could not be twisted or undone. My daughter's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table, her earlier confidence now nothing but ashes, and I could see in her eyes the dawning realization that she had lost not only the inheritance she believed was hers, but the image of control she had built for herself. Around the room, relatives nodded slightly, their expressions shifting from uncertainty to acceptance as the lawyer's words left no room for interpretation. It was final, it was law, it was ironclad. My heart swelled not with pride but with a deep, quiet relief, the kind that comes when justice finally breaks through after years of being overlooked. I thought of my wife again, of her gentle smile, and the way she always seemed to see further than I did, and I realized that she had known this day would come, that she had prepared this shield for me as her last gift. My daughter lowered her gaze finally, her protest sputtering into silence, and I watched as the fire drained from her posture, leaving her slumped and defeated. The lawyer concluded with a firm statement that the will stood beyond contest, that his office had ensured its legitimacy through every possible measure, and with that, the room exhaled collectively, the tension breaking like a storm passing over. I remained silent, holding my dignity close, but inside I felt the unshakable truth settle in me like bedrock. I was not powerless. I was not invisible. And my wife had made certain that no one, not even our daughter, could strip me of the life we had built together. As the lawyer's final words about the ironclad will settled over the room, I felt the atmosphere shift in a way that was impossible to ignore. For in that moment, what had once been humiliation turned into public vindication, and the very people who had watched me in silence at the funeral now looked at me with new eyes. Where once they had seen only an old man cast aside by his daughter, they now saw the husband my wife had honored with her last act, the man she had trusted above all others to carry on her legacy. I could feel the weight of their stares, no longer cold or dismissive, but softened, curious, even respectful, as though they were trying to reconcile the image of me they had quietly accepted with the truth that now stood undeniable before them. My daughter, who had strutted into the office with such confidence, now sat wilted in her chair, her face pale, her eyes darting in shame as though she knew the room was no longer hers to command. Relatives who had once whispered about my supposed failures now avoided her gaze, unwilling to align themselves with her arrogance after hearing my wife's words. I watched their expressions change, the pity that had once been directed at me replaced by quiet admiration, their silence now heavy, not with complicity, but with acknowledgement that they had been wrong. My vindication did not come in loud applause or grand gestures, but in the small, unmistakable signs. The cousin who gave me a nod of respect, the old family friend who leaned back in his chair with a softened gaze, the aunt who placed her hand gently over her heart as though moved by the realization of what my wife had chosen. It was as if the room itself had turned in my favor. And though I did not seek their approval, I could not deny the warmth that spread through me after being stripped of dignity for so long. My daughter's eyes flicked around the table, searching desperately for someone to take her side, but she found only averted gazes, lips pressed tight, shoulders turned slightly away. Her isolation was now complete, and though it pained me to see her fall so far, I could not help but feel that this too was justice, the consequence of her cruelty and entitlement laid bare for all to see. My vindication was not just in the inheritance, nor even in my wife's loving words, but in the way the truth unfolded publicly, in the way every witness who had seen me walk out of that funeral in shame now saw me stand quietly vindicated, not by anger, not by argument, but by love stronger than death and law stronger than greed. I sat in silence still, but this silence was different from the one at the funeral, for this silence was filled with power, the quiet confidence of a man who no longer needed to prove himself. My wife had spoken for me, the law had protected me, and now the very eyes that had once judged me bore witness to my worth. I thought of her then, my wife, and I whispered silently in my heart that she had done it, that she had given me back the dignity that had been stripped away, that even from beyond the grave she had restored the truth of who I was. My public vindication was not loud, it was not dramatic, but it was undeniable, and it was enough. The fall of my daughter's arrogance was not sudden like a single strike of lightning, but slow and heavy like a crumbling wall, each piece breaking away until nothing remained but the ruins of what she had built inside her own pride. She had entered that office with her head held high, certain the day would end, with her pockets full and her position secured. But now she sat slumped in her chair, her once confident posture wilted, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her handbag, as though even that small motion could ground her in the collapsing world around her. Her eyes, which had gleamed with expectation, now darted wildly, searching for allies in a room that had turned against her, but no one met her gaze. The same relatives who had once admired her composure now saw only the greed that had poisoned her, and their silence condemned her more powerfully than any words could. She muttered weak protests under her breath, her voice cracking, her arguments disjointed. And for the first time in years, I saw not the arrogant woman she had become, but the lost child. She still was beneath the layers of entitlement. Yet, even as pity tugged faintly at my heart, I could not ignore the truth that she had brought this upon herself. The arrogance that had once made her believe she could cast me aside at her mother's funeral had now left her stranded in humiliation, and I could see the realization dawning on her that she had misjudged not only me, but her mother as well. Her fury had given way to shame, though she tried to mask it with restless movement, but there was no hiding from the eyes of the room. Each guest had witnessed her tantrum, her accusations, her selfish demands, and now they watched her shrinking, powerless, stripped of the control she had so fiercely clung to. The lawyer's calm presence only deepened her defeat, for his steady explanations reminded her that no amount of shouting or denial could undo the will, no manipulation could twist the law, no pride could rewrite her mother's words. She had lost not only the inheritance she coveted, but also the respect of the family she once commanded with her confidence. I sat quietly, letting her fall unfold without interference, for I knew that this was not a lesson I could teach her with lectures or scolding, but one she had to learn by facing the consequences of her own arrogance. My silence stood as a contrast to her unraveling, and in that contrast the truth became clear to everyone present. Where she was consumed by greed and entitlement, I was anchored by patience and devotion, and the difference spoke louder than her protests ever could. She finally rose from her chair, her movements jerky, her face flushed with humiliation, and she gathered her things with hands that shook more than she wished to reveal. She muttered that she did not care, that none of it mattered, that she would make her own way without any of us. But her words rang hollow, brittle, the last defenses of pride crumbling in a room where no one believed her anymore. She stormed out of the office, her heels striking the floor in sharp defiance, but her exit carried no triumph, only desperation, and the heavy silence she left behind was filled not with judgment of me, but with pity for her. I watched her go, my heart heavy, for though her arrogance had fallen and her cruelty had been exposed, she was still my daughter, flesh of my flesh, and her collapse left me torn between sorrow and vindication. Yet I knew, as the door closed behind her, that my wife had foreseen this fall, had known that her final act of love would expose the truth, and though it broke my heart to see my daughter so lost, it also freed me from the shadow she had cast over me. The fall of her arrogance was painful, but it was necessary, and in that moment I realized that sometimes love must allow pride to collapse before humility can grow. When the room finally emptied and the echoes of my daughter's angry footsteps faded down the corridor, I remained seated in my chair, my hands resting on the polished wood of the lawyer's table, and I felt the weight of everything that had just unfolded settle deep into my chest. The lawyer collected the papers with care, his expression calm but respectful, and the few relatives who lingered offered me hesitant nods, their eyes softer now than they had ever been before, as though they finally understood the truth my wife had made clear. I sat in silence, letting their glances pass over me, but inside my heart a storm of emotion swirled. Grief for the wife I had lost, sorrow for the daughter who had chosen pride over love, and quiet gratitude for the vindication I had never thought I would receive. The final word, though spoken by the lawyer, belonged to my wife, for her letter had given me back not only dignity, but strength, reminding everyone, and especially me, that love had not forgotten me, that devotion had not gone unseen, that my sacrifices had meant something. As I rose slowly from my chair, I felt as though she were walking beside me, her hand still on mine, guiding me through the emptiness with the same gentle assurance she had given me in life. I thought back to the long nights we had shared, the laughter that had filled our home, the struggles we had endured side by side, and I realized that this final act of love was her way of keeping her promise to stand with me always. My daughter's betrayal cut deep, but it could not erase the truth my wife had left behind. And though it pained me to watch her storm out of the office in shame, I knew that someday, perhaps when pride no longer clouded her heart, she might return and understand the lesson her mother had left for her. Until then, I carried the responsibility of honoring that final word, not by flaunting wealth or basking in vindication, but by living with the same quiet devotion that had defined our life together. As I stepped out into the sunlight, the cold air biting at my cheeks, I felt the world shift around me, no longer pressing me down with judgment, but lifting me with a newfound respect that had been absent for too long. People had seen me. Truly seen me, not as the weak old man my daughter had dismissed, but as the husband my wife had cherished, the man she had chosen to trust with her legacy. The final word was not about money or property. It was about love, about recognition, about the truth rising when all else had fallen away. I walked slowly down the street, my steps steady though my heart remained heavy. And I whispered a quiet prayer of thanks to my wife, telling her that I had heard her, that I had felt her love, that I would carry it with me until my own final day. The wind carried my words away, but I believed she heard them, wherever she was, and I felt a strange peace settle over me. The humiliation of the funeral, the sting of betrayal, the silence of the crowd, all of it had led to this moment, where love had spoken louder than cruelty, where devotion had triumphed over arrogance, where dignity had been restored to a man who had once been cast aside. The final word belonged to her, but it also lived now in me, and I vowed that I would honor it with every step I had left, carrying not only her legacy but also the strength she had given me, a strength that even death could not take away. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.